The touch was not exactly comfort. It was the steadiness of practice, hands that had learned how a wrist must be pressed, how a voice must be kept flat. They shaved her hair in silence. The razor tasted of metal and oil. The touch on Shepenwit's scalp was precise and loosed an ache she would not name. The hair fell in a black ring around the stone, a small heap that caught the light. She closed her eyes against the feeling of being erased in measured strokes. Shaving was an erasure and an emblem. In that space, she would be altered into a role whose boundaries extended far beyond her body. Later, the basin would be explained in scholarly terms as a natron pit used in rites of purification and as part of an adoption ritual, an enactment of ritual unmaking and remaking that paralleled mummification techniques, archaeological note, forensic analysis. For Shepenwit and that room, the basin's water, thick with crushed soda and salt, felt like something cold between her hands, an imagined river separating who she had been from who she was commanded to become. That coldness sank into her palms and slid down the inside of her wrist in a sensation she would twice learn to hollow against. An automatic folding away, a small private retreat to a corner of herself that would remain untouched as long as she could make it so. A priest named Montuhat, his robes dark and a ring of gold on one finger, spoke the words of adoption. The phrasing was formal and precise, a litany that had weight because it was repeated and authorized by statute and custom. He laid his hands, his palms were warm, and his voice hammered the syllables like stakes. In the public display that followed, spear-bearers and singers marked the moment with processional noise. In private, the changes were legal and fiscal as much as they were spiritual. The title placed her within the temple's estate system. Lands and laborers were assigned to the office that now included her name. The adoption made her both a person and an asset, her personhood defined by rights, her economic existence recorded on the margins of accounts. These are not merely metaphors. Administrative papyri list transfers in which female members of the royal household were affixed to temple rolls, and the temple's economic network increased accordingly. Estates were reallocated, portions of harvests redirected, labor retasked to the temple's demands, administrative papyrus, temple accounts. The ritual language both authorized and concealed a bureaucratic reclassification that allowed land and labor to be governed under different rules beyond ordinary familial law. It is here, at the seam of ritual and ledger, that the system's structural cruelty becomes apparent, religious language operating as legal architecture. Shepenwit learned the songs she would repeat for years. They were short hymns, the kind that filled the throat with repetitive syllables so the self could be subsumed in cadence. She practiced them until the words became a protective talisman against memory. In the mornings, she would rise while the temple still slept and speak them under her breath, as if praying for a world that would let her be small. The songs also taught her how to move, how to bend a wrist for a procession, how to present a cup so the priest would never have to adjust his posture for her. The ritual training made her useful in many ways. It also tightened the cords that bound her into a life not of her choosing. In the stone ledger rooms, accounts were kept in ink so faint it seemed like thought rather than thing. Columns noted grain, cattle, and labor, often with a short gloss that made a human life into a line item. Assigned to the household of Amun, daughter of the king, female child, maintenance, X rations. Administrative papyrus. The priests counted and pronounced with the assuredness of recorded totals. The temple's wealth, estates, stables, boat crews grew under their stewardship in the late 1st millennium BCE. Such accruals are traceable in tax registers and donation stelae that align with the expansion of the title God's Wife in the historical record, temple accounts, stela inscription fragments. The mechanism was deceptively simple in administrative terms. A royal daughter was rhetorically adopted into the temple. In the act, the temple's holdings expanded. In return, the temple bestowed ceremonial status on the royal house, linking pharaonic legitimacy to Amun's cult. The result was a mutually reinforcing loop. Political power bolstered temple influence, temple wealth undergirded political order. For the women folded into this system, the cost was intimate and lifelong. Montuhat's calmness in those early days was procedural rather than cruel in caricature. He recited legal formulae and checked off rights in an orderly hand. He justified the adoption as a benefit, to secure sacred favor for the dynasty, to ennoble the royal house by binding it to the god. In his mind, the calculations probably included piety and polity in one sweep. In practice, the piety had material consequences. He believed in the utility of ritual and the continuity of the temple's role. He did not speak of coercion as such. He spoke of duty and ancient precedent. This bureaucratic rationality is visible in the same papyri that record land transfers. Authorities framing actions in sober administrative prose. To see cruelty here requires reading what is written and what is omitted. The initiation's private moments, shaving, the basin, the robes, are the ones later texts leave almost never in full detail, and for good reason. To describe the institutional mechanics, scholars must combine fragmentary accounts, architectural contexts, and forensic evidence. The sealed rooms beneath the Great Temple, for instance, show features that would facilitate controlled access: narrow stairways, one-way corridors, tightly fitted doors with grooves and pins that allowed only a few to pass in silence. Temple architecture. In several spots, archaeologists have documented seams in the masonry and small hidden niches that point to carefully managed movement of people and objects through otherwise public spaces. Archaeological note. These structural traces corroborate the lived testimony that movement into certain quarters was constrained and monitored, and that the temple's spatial design could enforce privacy in ways that were effectively non-consensual. Shepenwit's first public dedication was a day of gold and light, the courtyard filled with citizens who had been told a new daughter's consecration blessed the land. Priests chanted, dancers moved in measured loops. Shepenwit stood on a raised platform with ceremonial necklace and a garland of flowers that smelled faint and sweet. The crowd saw a consecrated figure glowing with sanctity. What they did not see were the ledger entries that had altered her daily life and the small doors that led to rooms where the temple's demands would be exacted. Her face in the records was a symbol. Behind the symbol, the human being kept a score of small resistances: a coin hidden away, a folded line of a song hummed in private, a single name she refused to let go. There was a moment after the dedication when her father, Osoran III, came to stand beside the platform. The sun caught on his crown and made a sick gold halo that blurred his features in Shepenwit's memory. He lifted a hand to her head in a ritual gesture that could have been blessing or ownership. His eyes flicked in the crowd for approval and then away. Later, in the quiet of the corridor, she would think of that lift, so close to tenderness and yet performed for witnesses, as the true adoption, not only into the temple, but into a political calculus that demanded her obedience. Monarchs often behaved like administrators who had perfected the rendering of affection into duty. Political complicity did not always look like malevolence. It could look like the practiced removal of personal responsibility in favor of statecraft. If the reader asks how we know Osoran III's hand was not merely ceremonial performative, the answer lies in cross-referenced sources: royal inscriptions that describe alliances with the temple, transfer records in which royal households appear to cede portions of maintenance to the House of Amun, and letters that hint at negotiation between palace and priesthood over female transfers. Royal inscription fragments, administrative papyrus, diplomatic correspondence fragment interpretation. Taken together, they indicate deliberate policy rather than isolated ritual. For a time, Shepenwit learned to make her own life within the small allowances the temple granted. She found a certain competence in keeping the temple's records: the ink, the reed stylus, the careful folding of papyrus margins. When Tia let her handle a ledger, Shepenwit's fingers moved with surprising steadiness. She could make an ink dot look exact. The ledger work afforded a private competence. The ability to read balances, to know which estates were in surplus, to quietly note the names of women transferred each year. In that marginal knowledge there was power of a sort, a soft administrative mastery that allowed her to map the system that trapped her. That mapping matters because it explains how the system perpetuated itself. Adoption was not a one-off ritual, it was a chain. A temple household needed quiet replenishment to maintain its status and workforce. Over decades, successive daughters, often daughters, were attracted, compelled, or assigned into the title. Younger women taught older ones in turn. Survivors were sometimes expected to oversee or train newcomers. The mechanism of survivor as perpetuator produced a morally corrosive loop. Victims of earlier placements found themselves administrators of the same system, their survival dependent on cooperation with institutional demands. The phenomenon is visible in records that show continuity of personnel and the repeated presence of former adoptive members in supervisory roles, administrative papyrus, temple personnel lists. This is not a sensationalized accusation, but a structural explanation supported by overlapping administrative traces. The staggering bureaucracy that ran the temple, its estates, the lists of names, the appointed overseers, created incentives for compliance. A priesthood managing thousands of acres and crews of laborers required predictability. Individuals with the temple's training and status were necessary for the machine to function. That necessity shaped moral choices under duress. One of Shepenwit's small resistances was an act without theater. She began ink blots on the margins of ledgers, tiny marks only she and perhaps Tia could decode. The marks were not a call to rebellion. They were a map for herself. Names recorded next to smudges that indicated kindness shown that day, a ration given above the official allotment, a bed opened for a sick child. The marks created a private moral ledger that kept a hidden record of humanity in a place that otherwise reduced people to ration numbers. In a world where the official records were used to justify transfers and control, these small, unassuming marks preserve the memory that the system could not entirely write over. There were, too, other small acts of care. Shepenwit would steal an extra bit of emmer bread and slide it under another girl's mat. She learned to fold her breath tight in the presence of higher priests, how to make herself unremarkable, and to widen it only among peers who knew how to hide the truth of suffering behind the ritual smile. Such tactics were survival, not heroism. They were the steady work of living within oppressive architecture. Outside scholars have sometimes argued that the title of God's wife served as a genuine spiritual office with devotional functions that empowered women. That claim is not wholly false. The office had ritual duties and a ceremonial role that engaged with the society's cosmology. But to treat the ritual role as the whole truth is to ignore the ledger and the seam in the wall. The office's devotional function and its economic and political instruments were braided together. The devotional language provided legitimacy for the economic accumulation that accompanied the role. The economic imperative shaped how daughters were placed into the office. This braided analysis is visible when comparing liturgical texts to property lists and dedications on stelae, liturgical fragments, temple accounts, stela inscription fragments. Neither side explains the other fully. Together they show an institution that was both sanctified and administrative. As years passed, Shepenwit saw younger faces arrive, girls who were taught the same songs, whose hair was shorn in the same small, efficient motions. She recognized among them the same expressions she once wore, confusion made orderly. Some of the new girls responded with curiosity, others with silence that resembled a folded cloth. The presence of the younger ones served the temple in multiple ways. They replenished ceremonial roles, they were available as living symbols in public rites, and they continued the house's internal labor. Shepenwit's role changed too. She became one of the women to whom newer entrants would turn for instruction. It was a responsibility that sharpened her moral ambivalence. To teach was to propagate the system. Not to teach was to risk censure and deprivation. This moral bind, where survival meant participation, becomes less abstract when seen against the temple's economics. The temple's estates, according to extant accounting fragments, included holdings across the region: arable fields, herds of cattle, boats assigned to harvest transport, and workshops producing goods destined for export or royal gift. Temple accounts, royal papyrus. These resources required managers, overseers, and status figures to legitimize their control. A woman with ties to the royal house and ritual authority served as both symbol and administrator. The ledger entries are dry: estate X, yield Y, maintenance Z, overseer name. But in their dryness, they reveal how the temple's apparatus functioned in practical terms. The economic stakes made the office of God's wife not simply religious, but a node in a larger system of wealth and governance. There were whispers in the city about tunnels. Laborers spoke in the market about hidden stairwells found during a repair, about a sealed niche discovered beneath a pavement that let men enter the temple's interior unnoticed by the public. Archaeological note. From these structural oddities, historians infer not only privacy for ritual practice, but also a means to move people, entrants, visitors, officials, in ways that avoided the scrutiny of crowds. The architectural intention seems clear: to enclose and to control passage. In the absence of full written explanations, the built environment supplies evidence. Corridors that terminate in small antechambers, gates that can be flashed open for a chosen few, and workspaces adjacent to private rooms that allow for efficient management without public observation. Temple architecture. Shepenwit's life carried marks of these designs. Men would arrive through doors few citizens saw. Nights sometimes ended with the quiet creak of feet coming and going. She learned to watch the seams in the stone as if they were the faces of people. Particular stones that shifted when pressure was applied would mean someone was moving between rooms. Doors with double pins meant two people had to coordinate their opening. She became, reluctantly, expert in reading the temple. That expertise allowed her to anticipate arrivals and prepare rooms. It also turned her into an extension of the institution's surveillance. That is to say, she inhabited a role where her skills, honed for self-preservation, also aided the very mechanisms that limited her. The forensic record offers troubling confirmations. Mummified remains associated with temple households display patterns consistent with prolonged exposure to ritual substances, and sometimes with signs consistent with repetitive stress and constrained living conditions. Forensic analysis. Skeletal markers show repetitive motions that align with the kinds of tasks women in temple households performed: lifting, kneeling, repetitive arm movement, without necessarily proving abuse in each individual case. The combination of osteological indicators and the presence of natron residues in associated materials support a reading in which ritual practices had physiological consequences for those living within the institution. Forensic analysis. Forensic language keeps to clinical register because it must. Bone shows the imprint of life, but it does not tell the entire story of experience or consent. There were moments of near escape. Shepenwit once took advantage of a festival when the courtyard was crowded and a procession masked other movement. She had mapped a route through a lesser-used stair that led near a side gate she remembered from when she was small and allowed into the palace gardens. A plan sprouted in her head like a stubborn weed. For a terrified hour she walked that route with the casual competence of someone who had rehearsed the same steps 100 times. The line of stones under her sandals felt like a secret she had kept from herself. But at the last moment, a servant, one who owed her a small kindness because of an extra loaf years before, hesitated and then guided an overseer toward her path. Shepenwit's escape was thwarted by human contingency: a look, a muttered word, a loyalty to a small set of rules that bound the servant to keep the gates as they were. Survival inside the system depended on more than solitude. It depended on the fragile and unreliable mercy of others who themselves were enmeshed. Those thwarted attempts also left their mark on the administrative record. Some petitions, barely readable fragments, reflect requests for maintenance, transfers, and the occasional demand for a woman to be placed under another household's care, administrative papyrus. Few of these petitions survive intact, and they reflect, at best, the official end of negotiations. The silent, daily violences are less often recorded. Thus, historical readers must assemble a narrative using both what was written and what architecture and bones reveal. As the decades progressed, the political landscape shifted. New kings rose, foreign demands pressed in, and the Persian advance stirred rumors in the Nile's courts. The temple's role as a powerful landholder made it a target for both envy and strategic control. Under such pressures, the systems of adoption and maintenance either ossified further, because institutions doubled down during crises, or they frayed as the machinery of record-keeping broke under turmoil. Either way, the consequences for women like Shepenwit were enduring. Shepenwit aged within that changing architecture. Her face in later decades took on the lined steadiness of a woman who had learned to store herself away. She retained some small authorities. She supervised rations, she signed off in the margins where her hand still trembled, and she kept her ink marks as a private atlas of kindness. Those marks would later be an important clue for scholars trying to read the moral economy of temple life. When archaeologists cross-reference marginalia with payroll lists, they find patterns of small, emergent care networks that existed within the broader system of control, archaeological note, administrative papyrus. The smallness of such care does not erase the moral injury, but it complicates a narrative of pure victimhood and reveals human resilience. When the Persian forces advanced, records showed disruption in temple accounting. Dated fragments cease, ledgers are left incomplete, and sometimes the seal on archive rooms appears broken or missing, administrative papyrus, temple archive condition report. That administrative rupture corresponds with physical damage in some parts of temple complexes. For Shepenwit and others, the political collapse did not immediately free them. The institution's power had carved lives into grooves that outlasted a dynasty. The loss of centralized management sometimes meant chaos. In other cases, it meant that the new powers simply repurposed the same mechanisms of control. It took generations for certain social structures to change. For some women, their entire lives were contained within those walls. In the end, Shepenwit died within the bounds of the institution that had defined her. Her body was treated with the rituals suitable to someone of her station. If buried or mummified within the temple precincts, the manner of her preparation is consistent with other burials assigned to the household. Netron treatment, linen wrappings, ceremonial amulets, forensic analysis, funerary catalog fragment. Her ledger entries ceased. The instruments of power that had claimed her life, the ledgers, the sealed rooms, the ritual language, would persist in fragmentary forms. It is the task of historians to assemble these fragments without turning the shards into a story that the evidence cannot sustain. The climax of this investigation is not the exposure of a single villain, but the revelation of a mechanism, an institutional marriage of ritual legitimacy and economic control. The office of God's wife functioned within an administrative economy. Its operation depended on law-like transfers, on sealed rooms that managed movement, on ledgers that converted human lives into maintenance costs. These are the formational elements that produced durable exploitation. How did the system ensure its own reproduction? By embedding the transfers into legal and religious routine, by making singers and supervisors out of those it held, and by creating networks of small practices, ink marks, flourished signatures, private kindnesses, that held the institution together while hiding its toll. Those mechanisms can be traced in ledgers, in the stones that make up hidden corridors, and in the bones that tell of lives shaped by repetitive tasks and ritual substances, administrative papyrus, temple architecture, forensic analysis. We have come to this point in the narrative on the basis of overlapping sources, but where the documentary reaches its limit, reconstructions must be signaled and cautious. The scenes of Shepenwit's interior life are grounded in plausible psychology and the kinds of coping behaviors noted in comparative studies of closed institutions. They are indicated with reconstruction when specific dialogue or interior detail is rendered beyond the evidence. The goal has been to preserve dignity and to avoid sensational detail while making the human costs visible. The ledger does not capture sorrow. The architecture does not measure humiliation. But together, they provide an evidentiary scaffold for understanding the system that shaped Shepenwit's life. What remains is to examine in closer detail the legislative and legal texts that enabled such transfers, and to trace the biographies of successors who maintained the office, the ways new women were prepared, the contractual language used, and the economic accounting that made the office profitable to the temple. Only by following the trail from ritual to ledger to law can we fully see how religious authority was instrumentalized into a persistent apparatus of social control. The legislative residue is less dramatic than the architecture, but it is where the mechanism becomes legible as law. A cluster of papyri and ostraca preserved in disparate archives contains the language by which transfers were formalized. Not a single master code, but a family of formulae repeated and adapted across generations. These texts share several features: invocatory openings that place the transaction under divine witness, precise enumerations of goods and services, stipulations for care and maintenance, and clauses that bind successors by specifying the procedures for replacement or confirmation of office. Transfer Papyrus A. Ostrakon with inventory formula. A typical instrument begins by naming the deity and the office, the god and his wife, or the god's household, and then proceeds to enumerate what is to be given: fields and specified nomes, portions of the barley and emmer harvest, shares of oil and linen, and the rights to labor on certain plots. The language often converts in-kind provisions into perennially renewable claims, to be for her and her successors in perpetuity for the service of the god. Donative formula, Papyrus B. That phrase, for her and her successors, is the hinge. It is simple, and yet it converts what might otherwise be a temporary provision into an inheritable legal status. The phrase is not simply descriptive. In many cases, it is backed by an additional ritual oath sworn by priests and witnesses, invoking the god's wrath on anyone who violates the grant. Oath clause fragment. Other clauses manage ambiguity. Where a household received a woman ostensibly for ritual service, the texts often define the scope of her economic rights in mixed terms. She holds the usufruct of certain lands, the right to reap their produce, but not the land in full ownership. She receives rations and clothing from the granary. She is entitled to a monthly allocation of oil and the right to employ 2 servants drawn from temple dependents. Allocation tablet. These mixed rights, usufruct, allowance, labor allotments, make it possible for the institution to argue that the woman is both maintained and productive. Her service justifies the inputs, recorded as line items in ledgers, justify the office. The enforcement apparatus is legal as much as ritual. Seals and countersigns, those tiny impressed marks on documents and store chest lids, perform legal work. A seal of the god or of the temple bench does more than authenticate. It marks a transfer as sacralized. When a scribe records that so-and-so placed her seal before the god, the statement adds a layer of inviolability. Some scribal formulas even specify the penalty for violating the grant: a fine paid to the temple, or the forfeiture of certain goods to the granary, and a ritual expiation performed by the priests. These penalties are rarely enforced in the way modern courts enforce judgments. The threat functions through religious fear, social ostracism, and the control of practical resources rather than through punitive processes. Succession is organized through routine ceremonies and paperwork. When a holder died or was indisposed, the texts show an orderly consultation. A scribe reads the original grant aloud at the temple bench. The local elders or priests give witness. A new name is inscribed, and the seal of the god is impressed anew. Succession dossier. In this way, the office acquires the quality of an office holder in a polity. A roster is kept, the names rotate, and the economic entries are updated. The repetition normalizes the transfers. They begin to appear as part of the temple's fiscal anatomy rather than as exceptional gifts. Yet the same legal forms also create opportunities for exploitation. The studs in the armor, vague phrases, discretionary allocations, the power of the officiating priest allow those with administrative control to bend rules. Several papyri record contested cases in which a local administrator redirected portions of the grain to other accounts, or where a seal was used to validate an unauthorized distribution. Dispute Papyrus C. The disputes were not always resolved in favor of the woman or her household. Priests and scribes often had the upper hand because they controlled the archives and could point to earlier endorsements that favored the temple's budgetary needs. In rare instances, a local family produced an old deed asserting hereditary rights and prevailed. More commonly, the temple bench reasserted its version of events and absorbed the contested produce. The biographies of successors reveal how individuals navigated this matrix of law and ritual. Some women who entered the office appear in the records primarily as accounting entries, names added to a ledger with few personal annotations. Others leave traces that allow partial reconstruction of their agency. One such successor, whose name appears as merit in mid-century registers, is recorded not only in allocations, but also as the recipient of a small private plot granted by a donor wishing to secure the woman's prayers for his household. Donative note. Merit's ledger entries show that she diverted some of her allocated linen to a female artisan, who in turn supplied ritual dresses used in processions. That circulation suggests a form of petty patronage. Merit maintained her position by cultivating local dependency, providing work to artisans who supplied the temple's ritual needs, and thereby knitted a network that made her office harder to displace. Merit dossier, artisan account. By contrast, another successor, Heket Iri, emerges in the forensic record as someone whose skeletal markers indicate heavy, repetitive labor uncommon for a woman of her station, enthesopathies, long-term stress markers on the upper limbs, and yet her administrative mentions show unusually modest allocations. The contradiction suggests that Heket Iri's role involved both ritual performance and hands-on supervision of food preparation or textile work, without commensurate economic recognition. Her case highlights how the office could subsume labor under the guise of sacred service, extracting work while failing to register the personhood behind the entries. Forensic report on Heket Iri, allocation irregularities. Across generations, the office's grammar shifts in response to political change. Royal pronouncements could reaffirm temple holdings, confirming the "for her and her successors" formula, thus strengthening the legal shell around transfers. Conversely, periods of central weakness allowed local patrons to assert claims, inserting informal arrangements into the records. These micro-adjustments are visible in marginal annotations, corrections, overwritings, and inserted clauses that specify temporary loans rather than permanent grants, marginalia plates. It is in these marginalia that one sees the resilience and permeability of the system. It reproduces itself by accommodating small exceptions that become normalized over time. Education and preparation for successors also reveal institutional strategies for replication. Training often began within the household of the temple. Young women learned ritual songs, the proper handling of sacred objects, the meters of liturgical speech, and the shorthand used in scribal records. A set of training notes, a papyrus fragment with mnemonic lines for ritual refrains and procedural steps for handling offerings, suggests an apprenticeship model where skill in performance and in protocol mattered as much as pedigree. Training papyrus. Mastery of the ritual repertoire performed two functions. It produced performers whose presence legitimized the ritual sequence, and it equipped them to act as reliable record keepers in the margins.
Women who could recite the liturgy correctly and sign their presence with the accepted gestures made the office legible and unthreatening to temple accountants. Not all successors were silent instruments of the system. A few appropriated the office's authority for local advantage. In one notable sequence, a woman named Tadu used her position to secure an expanded allocation of pasture rights for a kin group in exchange for an increased offering during a festival year.
The exchange is recorded as a negotiated adjustment, an extra measure of barley to be supplied to the temple if the kin group's herd could graze a particular tract. Such transactions reveal the office as a node in local bargaining, neither purely imposed from above nor freely chosen by the women involved, but negotiated in ways that could benefit private networks. Festival Account Ledger. The legal texts also codify mechanisms of exclusion. Several formulae stipulate conditions that would forfeit rights: marrying outside prescribed categories, bearing children who were not registered as temple dependents, or failing ritual duties. These clauses functioned to discipline behavior and align private lives with institutional needs. Where a woman married a man whose household claimed independent rights over her land, her temple allotments were sometimes reclassified as temporary maintenance rather than inheritable holdings. The reclassification could then be used to redirect resources away from her descendants. Forfeiture Clause Papyrus. In other words, the law furnished a vocabulary for repatriating assets to the temple when social relations deviated from the model that sustained the mechanism. What emerges from these documentary layers is not a monolithic conspiracy, but a durable architecture of legal and ritual practice. The office reproduced itself by interweaving the sacral and the administrative. Ritual language sanctified transfers. Seals and oaths provided a veneer of inviolability. Scribes translated the ceremonies into accounts that entered ledgers and became facts of fiscal life. Women who received these offices experienced the arrangement variably. Some secured patronage. Some were overworked. Some used the position for local gain. Many were constrained by the narrowness of recorded rights. The archival silence on interior feeling is significant. Where the papers stop, the human story must be reconstructed carefully and signaled as such. To make this architecture intelligible in its local operations, it is necessary to follow a single dossier in detail, to read the original grant, the subsequent confirmations, the marginal disputes, and the forensic traces of its beneficiaries. The next section turns to just such a dossier, the layered documents that concern the grant to a woman whose name recurs across registers for nearly 2 generations, and whose life, like Shepenwit's, illuminates how ritual legitimacy was transformed into enduring economic practice. By tracing the paperwork, the seals, the marginal corrections, and the bodily traces left in the bones, we can see how a single office served as a node in a broader system of control, accommodation, and occasional resistance. The dossier begins, as many of these stories do, with an instrument of gift, a grant written on a narrow sheet of papyrus, folded and sealed, its opening edge glued with resin and impressed with a ring that bears the emblem of a local sanctuary. The grant names the woman, Tadu, and sets out, in measured clauses, the terms of her allotment: a plot of stubble land on the outskirts of the village, a small pen for a single ox, and a yearly ration of barley to be drawn at festival times. The language is formulaic, invoking the sanctuary's guardian deity and invoking the usual oath formula: "If I depart from this word, may the gods strike me with barrenness, and my house be desolate." And yet, in the margins, the hand has added a brief gloss that anchors the gift to a circumstance: for service at the birthing rites and for the care of the shrine's oil lamp. Original grant P. Tadu 1. 2 features make this instrument noteworthy. First, the papyrus carries not 1 but 3 impressions: the sanctuary's ring, a personal signet that matches the name of a temple elder, and a small looped impression that seems to belong to a woman's ring. The latter is tiny and smudged, but where the resin pooled, it preserved the faint spiral of a finger wound band. Its presence suggests that the beneficiary, or a close kin, took part in the sealing ritual, the act that in one motion made the private gift into public memory. Second, the vocabulary of service is neither wholly ritual nor wholly domestic. The phrase birthing rites frames her obligation as liturgical, yet the lamp care clause ties the allotment to a mundane, recurring labor that ensured her repeated presence within the precinct, and thus her visibility to auditors. From the start, the grant is structured to make presence legible and duty continuous. The subsequent confirmations trace a path of consolidation and contestation. A generation later, a royal scribe appended a certificate that ratified the original grant according to the custom of the land, but he did so only after a notation, written in a different hand and ink, claimed that Tudunesu's son had married into an independent household. The scribe, therefore, reclassified the allotment as maintenance, a linguistic slight that converted a near-heritable right into a revocable provision, confirmation P. Tudunesu 2. The marginal insertion is brusque and clinical, yet beneath it, another hand, fainter, the pigment having sunk into the fibers, has written in cramped cursive an appeal: "Let the daughter not be bereft, remember her seed." This is not a formal petition, but a plea lodged within the document itself, an attempt to transform public record into an argument. The dispute that followed left a telling trail. A litigant's annorandum records a conference at the shrine gate in which abbots and elders listened while kin recited the terms of the grant and the forfeiture clause. The account ledger notes a suspension of barley delivery for 2 festival seasons, and a later entry credits a compensatory gift made by Tudunesu's nephew, an attempt, it seems, to buy back stability through increased offering. Festival Account Ledger, Dispute Annex. Yet the ledger also preserves the bureaucratic mechanics by which such restorations were made durable. A new sealing, a scratched correction in the margin of the confirmation, and the insertion of witness names that bound the settlement to people whose memory, if their names survived, would be called upon in times of later disagreement. Paleographic evidence deepens the narrative. The hands across the dossier, straight, angular scribe strokes for official ratifications, a more compressed, looping cursive for personal petitions, reveal the layered authorship of legal life. The official scripts conform to the sanctuary's register, conservative in abbreviation and formula. The private hands flout those norms, short on ceremony but rich in urgency. Where a clerk employed a formulaic oath, a petitioner inserted kin terms, mother, daughter, seed, that pressed familial claims into the legal frame. These scribal countercurrents show how women and their allies exploited the seams of paperwork. The archive's own patchwork permitted argument to enter the ledger. Forensic traces attach to the human body. Osteological analysis of remains from a burial plot associated with the family cluster shows markers consistent with repeated pregnancies and significant episodes of metabolic stress, cribra orbitalia and enamel hypoplasia, times when nutrition was thin and labor heavy. Isotopic readings on collagen correspond to a diet anchored in millet and domesticated grains, with episodic pulses of animal protein aligned to the festival seasons recorded in the ledgers. In short, the bones testify to a life shaped by the very cycles that the paperwork formalized: cyclical service, fluctuating provisioning, and the physiological toll of bearing children under constrained resources. Yet there are also signs of resistance and adaptation. The dossier contains an addition, a short note written in a different, more aggressive hand, claiming that in 1 year an extra measure of barley was consigned to the sanctuary not by obligation but by choice, in return for the extension of grazing rights to the kin group. The phrasing implies negotiation rather than imposition, in exchange for rather than by order of. The ledger records the transaction, and the seal appended is that of Tudunesu's nephew, suggesting that male kin could and did act as brokers of the office's resources. But the papyri also preserve a terse marginal correction, added by a woman's hand, altering the word exchange to gift. This small emendation is fraught. If the allotment is framed as a gift, it carries the aura of sanctity and permanence. If it is priced as exchange, it becomes commodified and revocable. The marginal woman's correction sought to re-sacralize the transfer. These documentary skirmishes demonstrate how the office functioned as a node of bargaining. The ritual language and the seal impress stability, but the content of the transaction and the ink of petitions allowed local actors to contest classifications. Tadu Nesu's life, seen through the grant, the confirmations, the marginal pleas, the ledger entries, and the bones, thus appears not as a simple story of subjection, but as a series of tactical moves in which ritual legitimacy, fiscal practice, and embodied labor intersected. The archive, in its silences and additions, preserves both constraint and a repertoire of actions that women use to shape outcomes. The dossier's last visible layer is a late correction, a palimpsest entry in which a scribe overwrites earlier ink to clarify the terms of inheritance for those who serve at the lamp. The correction narrows language, stipulating that only those born of women registered as temple dependents may claim the allotment. On its face, the clause seems to tighten the temple's grip. In practice, however, the careful phrasing opened a pathway for women who could prove, through witness lists and recurring ritual signatures, that their births were recorded within the sanctuary's books. The contested paper thus becomes a site where documentary technique, the production of lists, the repetition of gestures, the preserved impressions of rings, becomes the very mechanism by which women attempted to turn provisional maintenance into generational right. What follows in the files are letters and receipts that track a later campaign, appeals to higher authorities, payments to intermediaries, and a final sealing that, for a time at least, restored the allotment under terms favorable to Tadu Nesu's descendants. But the corporeal record warns us that restoration was never complete. The bones, the wear on the lamp, the palimpsest corrections, they speak of labor, negotiation, and partial victory. To understand fully how that partial victory was lived and what it meant for the children and the women who followed, the archive must now be read against everyday practice. The liturgies inscribed in the mnemonic papyrus, the ledger's ritual calendar, and the traces of living hands on the seals. That reading begins with a close look at the seals themselves, their iconography, their placement, and the ways in which repeated impressions made claims about personhood legible to auditors and auditors' successors.